In the dead heart of the desert, where every shadow hides a secret, a lone rancher stumbled upon a cage. Inside, an Apache girl, marked with a sign dripping with vengeance. Blood calls for blood. Saving her would bind him to a storm of soldiers, bounty hunters, and a past he could never escape. What began as one man's mercy soon became a journey of fire, betrayal, and a love that defied death itself. But remember, out here in the West, every choice carves a legend, and every legend has a price. Part 1. The Desert and the Cage. Arizona Territory, 1874. The sun was merciless, carving heat into the land like a brand into hide. The desert stretched in every direction, not empty, but alive with whispers coyotes far off. Wind threading through mesquite branches, the dry rasp of stone against stone. Time did not flow here. It scoured. Elias Boone rode with the slowness of a man who had nowhere to be and too much behind him. His horse, a tired dun mare, carried both man and silence across the Santa Fe Trail. He was a rancher, but alone now, his cattle scattered, his family gone, his land holding little more than ghosts and a roof that leaked when it cared to. He had made peace with solitude, or at least learned to wear it like a second skin. But solitude does not always return the favor. That afternoon, as the horizon shimmered with heat, Elias saw something wrong. At first it looked like a trick of light, some scrap of metal abandoned by a wagon. But as his horse drew closer, the shape grew sharper, darker. It stood at the fork of two trails, where riders had to choose east toward the settlements or west into harsher wilderness. It was a cage. Iron bars, rusted but unbroken, squatted in the dust like a warning left for anyone fool enough to pass. A crude wooden sign hung from one corner, words scrawled in a jagged hand. Blood calls for blood. The letters were painted in a red so dark it might have been dried blood itself. Elias felt his mouth go dry, though the desert had already stolen most of the moisture from him. He reined in the mare, staring. At first, he thought the cage was empty, but then movement, small, desperate. A figure inside, curled against the bars. A girl. She was young, maybe no more than 18. Apache. From her hair, her skin, the proud line of her cheekbones, though they were hollowed by thirst. Her wrists bore raw cuts from where rope had bitten. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow, but her eyes were still alive, dark and burning, though they flicked toward him with the wariness of a cornered wolf. Elias sat still in the saddle, the sun pressing down like a hand. His chest tightened. Whoever had left her here hadn't meant her to live. The cage wasn't just punishment, it was display, a warning. He glanced again at the sign. Blood calls for blood. It was not written to explain. It was written to curse. For a long moment, Elias didn't move. The weight of choice pressed on him heavier than the heat. He knew what it meant to take her. It meant drawing the attention of whoever had put her here. The soldiers, the settlers, the men who called Apache nothing more than vermin to be driven out. It meant blood on his doorstep, sooner or later. But the girl stirred weakly, lifting her head just enough for him to see her eyes again. Eyes not asking, not begging, just refusing to die unseen. Elias Boone exhaled, low and sharp. "God help me," he muttered. Then he swung down from the saddle. The cage door was secured by a chain, locked tight with a heavy clasp. Elias pulled his knife from his belt, tested the metal. The lock was old, iron eaten with rust. A few strikes with the pommel of the blade, then another, until the clasp groaned and gave. The chain rattled to the ground. He crouched low, pulling the door open. The girl flinched, pressing back into the corner. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice gravel, worn thin by years of dust and silence. No answer. Only her eyes, watching, suspicious, waiting. Elias set his knife aside, opened his hands as if to show he carried no threat. Then, carefully, he reached inside. The girl's breath hitched, but she did not pull away as he slipped an arm under her shoulders. She was light, too light, her body fever-hot, bones sharp beneath her skin. He lifted her from the cage. She sagged against him, barely conscious, a rag doll smelling of sweat and blood. Her head rested against his chest for just a moment, before she tried to pull away, weak but fierce. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy now." She made a sound, low, like a growl, then slumped again. Elias looked once more at the cage, at the hateful sign swinging in the wind. He wanted to tear it down, burn it where it stood, but there was no time. Whoever had left her would be back, or someone else would come along and carry tales. He adjusted his hold on her, lifted her up to the saddle. The mare shifted nervously, but Elias steadied her with a hand. Then he climbed up behind, one arm keeping the girl upright against him. He cast a final glance at the crossroads. The cage sat silent now, its bars catching the sun like a trap waiting for another victim. The sign creaked as the wind caught it, words swinging in rhythm with the desert's breath. Blood calls for blood. Elias Boone turned his horse toward the trail that led home, his jaw set, his heart heavier than it had been in years. He did not yet know the girl's name or her story, but already he knew her presence would drag him back into a war he had tried to bury. As the mare carried them into the distance, the desert swallowed the cage and the sign behind him. But the words had already branded themselves into his mind, and the desert remembers, always. Part 2. Shadows in the Outpost. The ride back to the outpost took hours. The desert stretched longer with every mile, as if the land itself were trying to swallow the decision Elias Boone had just made. The sun bled into the horizon, leaving behind streaks of copper and bruised purple. The girl slumped in the saddle, held upright by the arm Elias kept wrapped around her. Every so often she stirred, her head shifting against his chest, but no words came, only the dry rasp of breath. By the time the outline of his ranch appeared, the stars had begun to prick the sky. It wasn't much of a ranch anymore, just a single-room cabin patched with sheet metal, a leaning barn, and a windmill that creaked like an old mourner. Still, it was all Elias had left. He dismounted carefully, easing the girl down into his arms. Her body was fever-hot, light as tinder wood. He carried her inside. The cabin smelled of dust, old smoke, and leather, a solitary man's shelter. He laid her onto his cot, the only bed in the room, then pulled off his coat to drape across her thin shoulders. The lantern flickered weakly, throwing shadows that swayed along the walls like restless spirits. Elias filled a basin with water, dipped a rag, and knelt beside her. Her wrists were raw where rope had bitten, her ankles bruised, her lips cracked. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he muttered, mostly to fill the silence. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, low, rough, almost pleading. He touched the rag gently to her lips, letting drops of water fall onto her tongue. She swallowed barely. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, dark and wide, unfocused, but alert enough to watch him. "There you go," Elias said softly. "Easy now. You're safe. For the moment, anyway." No reply. But her fingers twitched, brushing weakly at his sleeve before falling still. Elias cleaned the blood and dust from her wrists, wrapping them in strips of cloth. His hands were rough, scarred from years of work, but his touch was careful. The basin water turned muddy, with red and brown. When he finished, he leaned back, studying her face in the lamplight. She was young, too young to have eyes that carried something older than pain, something that waited, endured. "You remind me of a dry river," he said quietly. "Looks dead most of the year, but when the rains come, it runs deep and fast. Folks used to call it Quiet Snake. Don't know why. Just quiet." He shook his head, almost embarrassed at the sound of his own voice. Talking to a stranger. Talking to a girl who might already be half dead. "I'll call you Marisol," he decided aloud. "Just for now. You look like the name fits." Her eyes blinked once. Slow, as if she'd heard. But she said nothing. Elias stood, covering her with another blanket. "If you're hungry, there's beans. Not much, but better than air." Still, silence. He sighed, dragging his bedroll toward the door. "I'll be out in the barn. Give you space. Stranger watching ain't right." Before stepping outside, he glanced back one last time. She lay motionless, but her lips no longer trembled. The basin beside her glowed faintly with the color of what had been done to her. Outside, Elias emptied the water into the dirt. It soaked into the ground and vanished, as though the desert itself fed on suffering. The days that followed crawled by with the slow rhythm of desert life. But the silence inside the cabin was different now. Thicker, charged. Marisol, as Elias still called her, ate little, but enough to stay alive. She moved cautiously, always watching him, posture tight like a trapped animal. She never spoke, but sometimes he caught her gaze lingering when she thought he wouldn't notice. At night, Elias gave her the cot and took the barn for himself. His rifle always lay within reach. He told himself it was for her comfort, to give her space. But truthfully, it was also fear, not of her, but of what her presence meant. That sign still burned in his mind. Blood calls for blood. Whoever wrote it had meant for her to die slow. Whoever they were, they might still be coming. 3 mornings later, Elias found a boot print near the barn. Smaller than his, fresher than his, angled toward the cabin. He crouched, studying it. Cavalry issue, no more than a few hours old. His jaw tightened. He rose slowly, eyes scanning the ridges, but saw nothing but heat shimmer. Back inside, Marisol sat near the window, her body stiff. She pulled the blanket tighter when he entered. "You see anyone?" he asked. She gave no reply, only looked away. "I think we've got company," Elias muttered, mostly to himself. That evening, he kept the lantern low and sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. The wind had died. Coyotes howled far off. The stars blinked into view like ghosts shaking off sleep. Inside, he could hear Marisol pacing slowly, bare feet whispering against the floor. It was the next day when the rider came. Dust curled behind a chestnut horse as it approached. The man atop wore the blue and gold of the U.S. Cavalry, jaw rough with stubble, hat pulled low. Elias stepped down from the porch, hand resting casually on his belt. The soldier reined in. "You, Boone?" "Depends who's asking." "Captain Silas Monroe, Dust Hollow Station. We're tracking a fugitive." He pulled a folded notice from his pocket, handing it down. Elias took it, already guessing. A sketch of a young Apache girl. Sharp eyes, long hair, words scrawled beneath. Wanted for murder and escape. Dangerous. Reward $50. Elias studied the paper a second longer, then folded it and handed it back. Ain't seen nobody but jackrabbits and a mule that don't listen. You sure? Monroe pressed. Small, quiet. Might be hurt. Might be hiding. We think she was taken near Cottonwood Flats. Elias's jaw worked. Can't help you. Monroe's eyes narrowed. She's not just a runaway. She's part of a violent group. Savages. That sign they left blood calls for blood, they mean it. If I see anything, Elias said evenly, I'll send word. The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded once and turned his horse. See you do. Dust swallowed him soon after. Inside the cabin, Marisol stood beyond the curtain. She had heard everything. Her eyes were fixed on Elias when he entered, dark and unyielding. They came looking, Elias admitted, setting his hat aside. Showed me your face on paper. I told him no. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion and confusion battling in her stare. I don't know what you did, he said. Maybe someday you'll tell me. But out here, a man makes choices. I made mine. He busied himself with the pot on the stove, stirring beans already cooked, pretending not to notice her watching him. Behind him, she shifted just a breath, just a sound, but it cracked the silence a little wider. The desert outside held its breath, waiting. Part 3. The Past Unveiled and Confessions. The afternoon leaned toward evening, that hour when the light turns the desert the color of old coins. Elias Boone sat at the table, running a whetstone along the edge of his knife, slow and steady as breath. Steel whispered against stone. The rhythm kept his hands busy, and his mind from wandering too far into rooms he'd closed up years ago. Behind him, the cabin's single window framed a square of sky. Marisol stood there, still as a cutout in paper, watching the light thin across the yard. Since the soldier's visit, a new quiet had settled between them, not the guarded silence of strangers, but the heavy hush that comes when both sides realize the past has climbed onto the same horse and ridden into the yard. Elias set the knife down. You're safe here, he said, the words plain, unadorned. Her shoulders rose and fell. Safe, she murmured, as if testing the shape of the word in her mouth. Her voice was roughened by thirst and disuse, low but sure. There is no safe in this land. Elias didn't argue. He had no evidence to the contrary. She turned from the window and crossed the room in bare, careful steps. The blanket he'd given her hung from her shoulders, a humble mantle. She stopped near the table and laid a palm against the wood, as if steadying herself against something that moved inside her. They will come back, she said. The bluecoats, the others, they always come back. He nodded once. I know. Her eyes, dark and watchful, settled on his. Why did you tell him no? Elias glanced at the door, at the heat-blurred yard, then back at her. Because sometimes a man has to decide who he is, not who the world says. She studied him. There was something like disbelief at the edges of her stare, but not quite. Something softer, fighting for a place. Sit, he said, motioning to the chair opposite. Eat. He slid a bowl toward her, the familiar poverty of beans, but warm, and this time he'd tucked a strip of cured meat at the bottom, a secret he hoped her body would discover before her suspicion did. She sat, her posture tight, spooning carefully. After a few mouthfuls, she stopped and set the spoon aside. Her fingers found the inside of her wrist, touching the raw line there as if reading a scar like a story. When she spoke, it was almost to the table. The sign, she said. I did not write it. I figured Elias said. It is not our way, she continued, to leave words where the wind can carry them to anyone's eyes. If we must speak to the spirits or to our dead, we speak with smoke or drum. If we must warn, we warn in the old ways: stone, bone, cinder. Words are the white man's way. And the soldiers. He listened, unmoving. She drew a breath. They burned our camp in late winter. We had a priest some seasons before Jesuit, kind with his hands, stern with his eyes. He taught some of us letters. He said letters are fences in the wind. Her mouth tightened. The soldiers used those fences. They wrote our names where we could not erase them. Elias felt a small click inside, a piece of understanding sliding into place. The bounty paper, he said. The poster, she nodded. A drawing that is not my face, a name that is not my name, a charge that is not my act. But the letters are fences. They make a prison you cannot see, and the world is taught to respect a prison it cannot see. When they found me after the fire, they tied me. They beat me. They told me I had killed a white woman near the creek, that my people would learn to bow to the fence. Her gaze lifted to him, hot, steady, fearless for the first time. I did not kill her. The one who did was her husband. He killed, then cried, then used our shadow to hide his sin. The last sentence came out like a blade leaving a sheath. Elias didn't look away. The lines of her story were not new to him. Men had always been clever at moving guilt, the way a gambler moves a coin fast, smooth, and to his advantage. What happened at your camp? He asked, though he feared he already knew the shape of it. She set both hands flat on the table, fingers spread. They came at gray light. Soldiers, town men, ranchers. Some wore badges, some wore smiles. She swallowed. They did not ask for our leaders. They did not ask for our stories. They set fire, and the fire spoke for them. The lantern's flame hiccuped, as if the air thinned to listen. My mother died with the beads the priest gave her, she said, voice thinning. My little brother's in the smoke. My father, she paused, the word catching. My father was a minor chief. He carried our sign wolf beneath a red moon. We carve it on bows. We paint it on hides. He wore it burned into his belt. They took him to the council pole and hung him by the wrists. Like me, but higher, like a warning to the clouds. Silence crowded the corners of the room. I ran, she said, the word flat, honest. I ran to the hollow of an old tree. When they found me, I had a knife. They said it proved what they needed. They did not need truth. They needed a story easy to carry. The cabin's boards creaked, the way they did when the wind tugged at the seams. But there was no wind. Elias leaned forward, elbows on the table. And the cage? 2 days after, she said. They took me out past Cottonwood Flats, where the trail splits. They put me in the iron and left the sign. Not for me to read, for men like you. She lifted her chin. Men who pass and must choose. He understood the shape of the cruelty now. The cage at the crossroads was not merely punishment, it was theater. It dared the land to choose a side. Elias drew a slow breath and let it out through his nose. The knife on the table gleamed dully in the lantern light. He reached for it and then stopped, not from fear of her, but from knowledge of his own hands, how easily they could do harm when they were asked to do good. I believe you, he said. The words were quiet, so quiet he almost didn't hear himself say them, but they were steady. Marisol sat very still. It was as if something inside her had been waiting for that sentence and didn't know what to do now that it had arrived. She looked away, and when she looked back, her eyes shone but did not spill. She ran a thumb along the rim of the bowl, catching a sliver of lamplight on the nail. "My real name," she said at last, "is Eileen. It means fire in the wind. It is a name my father chose." She tilted her head a little. "Marisol is a pretty name, too. A name with water. Perhaps I will borrow it when I need to be soft." Elias's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Eileen," he repeated, tasting the sound. The name felt like flint against steel spark. Heat. A chance. She drew the blanket closer around her shoulders. "And you? Elias Boone, what fence holds your shadow?" He knew the moment was coming, had known it since he cut her from the iron. "You do not step into another's storm without being asked your own weather." He stood and moved to the stove, taking time that wasn't needed to adjust the pot, to busy hands that had been still too long. When he turned back, his face had the look of a man who opens an old trunk and breathes in the dust. "Spring before last," he said. "I was out hunting strays. Came back to smoke. The barn was half flame, half scream. I could hear my sister, Ellie, 16 and stubborn as a wet mule, crying from inside." He swallowed. "I stood there with a rifle I did not raise. I waited for neighbors. I told myself there were too many, that my one body would only add to the count the fire was already keeping." By the time help came, the fire had learned her name. He hadn't planned to say it like that. But once he started, he could not stop the truth from choosing its own words. "I buried her with my hands," he went on. "Neighbors took care of the rest. The boards, the dishes, the words men say when they mean well and know nothing." He looked at his palms, as if he could still see ash ground into the lines there. Eileen watched him without blinking. "And who did they say lit the fire?" "Apache," he said. She tilted her head. "And what do you say?" "I say I don't know," he answered. "I say I was not there to see. I say the truth in these parts has a way of dressing in borrowed clothes. I say blame is a ladder men climb when they feel small." The lantern hissed again, and the cabin seemed to lean closer around them, the way a circle tightens when a story finds its heart. "I did not save her," he said, the words blunt now. "And maybe it would have made no difference if I'd run into that barn with a bucket and a prayer. But you asked my fence. That's it. I am a man who did not go into the fire when the fire had my sister's name." Eileen sat with that a long moment. Then, "That is why you opened the cage." He didn't pretend otherwise. "Maybe." She rose from the chair and crossed to the door, the blanket trailing her like a shadow. For a heartbeat, Elias thought she would leave, step out into the hollow dark, and vanish into the night as silently as she had entered his life. Instead, she opened the door and stepped only onto the porch. The air cooled at day's end, the kind of cool that feels like mercy only because it comes after hurt. Elias followed, standing in the doorway. The yard was a map of long shadows and old work. The pump, the trough, the fence, mended in 3 different styles, as the years had taught 3 different lessons. Eileen knelt in a patch of dust near the step and picked up a small stick. She began to draw, precise, sure. He moved closer. In the dirt, a wolf's head took shape, eyes up, mouth closed. Above it, a round moon shaded with quick strokes. She scored a thin ring around the moon, then cross-hatched the circle until it darkened to a blood coin red. "Our sign," she said. "Wolf under the red moon. We put it on the things we must remember, and the things that must remember us." Elias crouched, setting his palm beside the drawing, fingers spread in the dust. It wasn't a touch offered or taken. It was what a witness does when words feel like trespass. Eileen's hand stilled. For a moment, the two shapes, man's hand, wolf's mark, rested side by side in the dirt, both temporary, both truer for it. "Captain will return," she said finally, "and not alone. Men with tin on their chests, and more men without but wishing to wear it." "Then we'll be ready," Elias said. She looked up at him. "Are you a man who waits for neighbors, Elias Boone?" He took in the yard, the barn, the tired windmill, the single strip of sky that belonged to him and no one else. "I am a man who has learned the cost of waiting." The red edge of the moon slid up from the horizon like a quiet promise. Coyotes answered the night from far off, the sound rising and falling like the breath of something older than all their names. Aileen stood, the blanket slipping. She didn't fix it. The night air pressed against her skin and did not ask for anything in return. "If we run," she said, "they will hunt us. If we stay, they will burn us. If we run smart," Elias said, "they will still hunt us, but they will have to guess which way the wind is going. And men who chase the wind get thirsty." She considered that, a small angle to her mouth that was not a smile, and not its opposite. "Sonora," she said, as if weighing the word, its heat and its hiding places. "South is a long road. In Overdod, I know," he said, "but I've got 2 horses and a debt to pay a ghost." "A ghost," she repeated softly. "And what does she want?" "Something more than fire," Elias said. Aileen drew the stick through the wolf and the moon in one sweeping line, not erasing them so much as reminding them they were part of the same earth that would soon take the mark back. She dropped the stick and looked at him fully. For the first time since the cage, her gaze held no calculation, only choice. "Then teach me your roads," she said, "and I will teach you how to hear the land when it is not speaking to you." He nodded. It felt like a pact, spoken to the porch boards and the dark beyond. The desert, which remembers everything, recorded it without comment. From the east, a low tremor of hoofbeats reached them late, just a rumor in the earth. A murmur unspooling along the ridge. Elias stepped back into the cabin and returned with the rifle. He didn't lift it to his shoulder. Not yet. Aileen's eyes flicked to the horizon, then to him. "Neighbors?" she asked. "No," he said. "Men who never learned to wait." The hoofbeats faded, or swerved, or became merely the drum of their own blood. Either way, the night closed its fist again, and the sky finished turning the color of old coins. Inside, the lantern burned steady now. The beans on the stove had gone quiet. The drawing in the dust held its shape for a while longer, and then the wind, late to the story, brushed its first line across the porch and took half the wolf's face with it. They went inside without speaking. Some things were settled, some things were not. But the decision that would decide the rest had stepped over the threshold with them. Tomorrow would ask its price. Tonight, the outpost kept them, and the desert kept score. Part 4. Love and the Pursuit. The wind shifted that week, dragging with it the scent of sage and smoke. For days Elias Boone had watched Marisol Aileen, as she had called herself, move about the outpost like a shadow relearning its shape. She fed the mule, swept the floor, stacked wood near the stove. None of it asked of her, yet she did it, as if proving she belonged somewhere. One night, as the desert cooled, Elias sat by the fire pit, sharpening his knife. The rasp of steel on stone matched the rhythm of his pulse. Aileen stepped outside, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. For a long moment they said nothing, only watched the stars knit themselves into a roof of silver. Finally she asked, "Why did you not let me die in that cage?" Elias's jaw flexed. "Because I've already let one die." She studied him. Then she came closer and sat across from him, the flames painting her eyes with restless light. Silence held them both until she leaned forward, voice softer. I want to live. Do you understand? Not just breathe. Live. That night, in the wavering glow of fire and shadow, their lips met, hesitant at first, then certain. It was not hunger but recognition, the kind of touch that admits how fragile they both were and dares the world to break them again. But the desert carries whispers faster than lovers' promises. 2 mornings later, hoofprints cut across the trail near the ranch. Not cavalry this time, different boots, different horses. Elias knew the marks of bounty men. By evening, dust rose on the horizon. 3 riders, one with a tin badge that glinted meaner than the others. They dismounted at the gate. The leader spat, a man thick in the shoulders, eyes sharp with greed. Elias Boone, he called. We heard tell you're harborin' an Apache girl, worth $50 alive, 20 dead. That's a fine deal for a lonely rancher with nothing but ghosts for company. Elias stepped off the porch slowly, rifle across his arm. His voice was steady, but each word carried weight. You hear a lot of things, Hank Dillard. Don't make 'em true. Dillard smirked. We aim to check inside. You got a warrant? Elias asked. This ain't a court, Boone. This is survival. Stand aside, or burn with her. The other 2 shifted in their saddles, hands brushing rifle stocks. The air hung brittle, ready to snap. For a heartbeat, Elias thought it might end right there in his yard. But greed has patience. Dillard narrowed his eyes, spat again, and swung into the saddle. Next time we come, he said, it won't be words. They rode off, leaving the promise of fire behind them. That night, Elias sat by the barn fire, turning something in his hands. It was the sign from the cage. He had pulled it from the dirt where he buried it. The words, "Blood calls for blood," stared back, faded but unyielding. Aileen approached quietly, wearing one of his coats too large for her frame. She stood beside him without speaking, eyes on the fire. I should have burned it sooner, Elias muttered. She didn't answer, only moved closer, until her shoulder touched his. He fed the sign to the flames. The wood hissed, curled, resisted. But fire takes everything in the end. Ash lifted into the night sky like black snow. Aileen whispered then, her voice barely above the crackle. Thank you. The word landed heavy, holy. Elias looked down at her, and for the first time in years, his chest felt alive enough to ache. But mercy has a short memory in the desert. By dawn, Elias packed dry biscuits, jerky, a canteen into the saddlebags. He saw smoke on the horizon, too steady to be a campfire. Word had spread. The outpost was no longer safe. We have to go tonight, he told her. Eileen's eyes did not flinch. She already knew. South, she said. Past the border. Sonora. Some say your people live free there. Her gaze softened. She stepped close, fingers finding his hand. I want to live, she said again. Careful, deliberate. I want to live as your wife. The words struck him harder than any bullet. He drew her against him, kissed the crown of her head. Then we'll ride till the desert runs out. Sundown found them ready. 2 horses saddled. The outpost door left swinging in the wind. No goodbye but silence. They rode beneath the stars, moonlight silvering the ridges. The desert opened, endless and waiting. 10 miles from the border, the land flattened into scrub and stone. Elias's gut tightened. The night felt watched. Then came the crack. A rifle's report, sharp and merciless. Pain tore through his side. Elias jerked in the saddle, collapsed hard into the dirt. Ah, yes! Eileen's scream ripped the silence. She leapt from her horse, fell to her knees beside him. Blood already soaked his shirt. "Keep going," he rasped. "No." Another shot split the air, striking stone nearby. Figures appeared on the ridgeline, 2 riders, rifles leveled. Dillard's men. Elias tried to rise, groaning, but his knees buckled. "We have to move." Aileen hooked his arm over her shoulders, dragging, half carrying, as bullets spat dust around them. She pulled him toward a cleft in the rocks, stumbling, her breath ragged. "Believe me," he growled through clenched teeth, "I won't die easy." They staggered into the narrow pass. The echoes of gunfire faded. The riders would not follow here. The rocks swallowed them in shadow. Inside the cleft, Elias collapsed to his knees, blood dripping onto the dust. He looked up at her, pain and wonder tangled in his gaze. "You said you wanted to be my wife," he rasped. Eileen cupped his face, fierce despite the tears burning her eyes. "I meant it." His lips curved, even through the pain. "Then we'd better make it through this pass." She pressed her forehead to his, her voice a prayer to fire and wind. "We will." And in that moment, love became defiance, and defiance became survival. Part 5. The legendary ending. The rocks held them through the night. Aileen bound Elias's wound with strips torn from her own blanket, her hands trembling but determined. His breath came ragged, each inhale dragging against pain. But it came. That was enough. At dawn, the desert softened to gray. Aileen scouted the ridge, her eyes sharp, her body tense as a bowstring. No riders. Dillard and his men had pulled back, waiting or circling for another chance. Either way, the desert was theirs for now. She returned to where Elias lay, propped against the stone. His skin was pale beneath the stubble, lips dry, but when he opened his eyes, there was still fight in them. "You're too stubborn," she said softly. A corner of his mouth twitched. "Takes stubborn to live out here." She gave him water, drop by, careful drop. Then he asked, "Tell me something true." She hesitated, then placed his hand against her chest, over her heart. "Aileen," she said, "that is my name. It means fire in the wind. My father gave it to me." Elias closed his eyes, as if to let the name settle inside him like a prayer. When he opened them again, his voice was rough but steady. "Aileen, you're the only fire I've ever wanted to keep." For a moment, the desert seemed to pause. As though listening, days bled into weeks. Somehow Elias did not die. Fever raged, then broke. His wound scarred, but held. With Aileen's care and the stubborn strength that had carried him this far, he rose again slowly, like a tree broken in storm, learning to grow toward the sun once more. They crossed the border under cover of night, leaving behind the land of fences and false papers. South into Sonora they rode, where mountains stood like old guardians, and rivers still whispered songs no law had learned to silence. There, in a clearing by a river bend, they built a lodge of pine and hide, humble but strong. No trophies on the walls, no portraits to boast of lineage. Only bundles of herbs, a child's blanket waiting to be finished, and the silence of 2 souls who had learned that love is the only answer to death's endless questions. Aileen stitched a tiny shirt one evening, her belly rounded gently beneath her woven sash. Elias trained a young Mustang nearby, murmuring commands, patient as stone. Every so often he looked back, and when his eyes found her through the curtain's flutter, he smiled. This was not the peace of forgetting. It was the peace of survivors, who knew scars never vanish, but still chose to grow around them. One twilight, Eileen walked barefoot to the river. The current moved slow, steady, like a memory that refuses to fade. She placed her hands on her belly and whispered, "Little one, your father did not just forgive, he loved, and he kept his promise." Footsteps behind her. Elias joined, his hand finding hers without words. Together they watched the water slip past, carrying with it stories the desert could not bury. For a while, it seemed the past had loosened its grip, but the West does not forget. Some nights, when the moon swelled red, Eileen would hear coyotes cry in the distance. The sound echoed the wolf beneath the blood moon, her family's sign, carved into her memory forever. She would close her eyes and see again the flames, the cage, the cursed words. Blood calls for blood. She knew the men who hunted them might still ride, that hatred did not die just because they had crossed a river. She knew someday the desert might come to collect what it was owed. Yet in Elias's arms, with his breath steady against her hair, she also knew something else. Love itself was a kind of defiance. To choose tenderness in a land that only taught violence, that was rebellion enough. Seasons turned. Grass grew green at the river's edge. Wildflowers braved the wind. And Eileen's child was born under a sky full of stars. A boy, his first cry loud and certain. Elias held him close, awe softening the hard lines of his face. "We'll name him what?" Elias asked. Eileen looked out at the river, at the wind-bending reeds, at the firelight dancing on their humble lodge. "Call him Mateo," she said, "gift of God. Because after all the fire, we were still given this." Elias kissed her forehead. "Mateo Boone," he whispered, as though staking the name into the soil itself. But legends are not built only on peace. They are built on the tension between memory and hope. On nights when the fire cracked low, Elias would take out the knife he had carried for years and turn it in his hands. The blade bore scratches of old battles, stains the desert never cared to wash away. He would stare into the steel, his reflection fractured by scars, and wonder how long peace could last before the world came knocking again. Eileen would notice, and she would come to him, laying her hand over his, steadying the knife until it was still. "Let tomorrow burn if it must," she would say. "Tonight we live," and so they did. Years later, travelers along the Santa Fe Trail told stories of a rancher who had vanished with an Apache girl the soldiers swore was a murderer. Some claimed he died in the desert. Others said he joined her people in the mountains and became one of them. But down by a quiet river south of the border, under the watch of old mountains and endless sky, a different story lived. Not the kind that made it to posters or fences, but the kind told in whispers, of two hunted souls who found each other, and in defiance of fire and blood, built something that endured. Not history, not myth, something in between. Out here, every story leaves its mark. If you want to hear more untold legends of the West, ride with us. Subscribe now and never miss the next tale.